The desert wind carried the sound of departing hooves, each rhythmic beat growing fainter until silence swallowed the barren landscape whole. 23-year-old Mercy Callahan sat motionless on the sun-baked ground, her unseeing eyes fixed on nothing while the cruel reality settled around her like dust after a stampede. Her own blood had abandoned her here, 40 miles from the nearest town, with nothing but the clothes on her back and a canteen that would be empty by sunset. The Callahan name had once commanded respect across 3 territories, but that was before the accident that stole her sight 2 winters ago, before she became what her Uncle Jeremiah called dead weight, and her cousin Boyd dismissed as more burden than a lame horse. They'd debated her fate for months around campfires, their voices carrying cruel calculations about feed costs and winter provisions, never knowing she could hear every whispered word about putting her down like an injured animal. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun climbed higher, its heat pressing down on Mercy's shoulders like a blacksmith's hammer. She had learned to navigate by sound and touch during her months of blindness, but here in this wasteland, there were no familiar creek beds or worn cattle paths to guide her. Just endless stretches of hardpan and scattered brush that rustled with the movement of creatures she couldn't see but could sense watching her. Her fingers traced the rough fabric of her split riding skirt, feeling for the small knife her late father had given her before consumption claimed his life. The blade was barely longer than her palm, meant more for cutting rope than defending against the wolves and coyotes that would come with nightfall. But it was all she had, along with the stubborn Callahan pride that refused to let her lay down and die without a fight. The family had left her at what Boyd called Widow's Point, a rocky outcropping where legend said a rancher's wife had waited for her husband's return from a cattle drive that never came. Mercy's exploring hands found the weathered remains of a wooden cross, its inscription worn smooth by decades of desert wind. She wondered if the widow had sat in this same spot, listening to the same eternal silence, feeling the same crushing weight of abandonment. A distant sound made her freeze, the soft scrape of leather against stone, followed by the careful placement of boots on loose gravel. Someone was approaching from the east, moving with the deliberate caution of a man who'd learned to read danger in every shadow. Mercy's hand tightened on her knife handle as she turned toward the sound, her other senses sharpening the way they'd learned to do since darkness claimed her world. The footsteps stopped about 20 feet away, close enough that she could hear the stranger's measured breathing and the creak of well-worn leather. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weathered quality of a man who'd spent more time talking to horses than people. "Miss, you hurt?" The question was simple, but Mercy detected something else in his tone, genuine concern mixed with careful wariness. Most men who found a woman alone in the desert would assume she was either lost or running from something. This stranger seemed to sense there was more to her story than a simple case of being turned around on the trail. "Depends on your definition of hurt," she replied, keeping her voice steady despite the fear gnawing at her chest. "My body's intact, if that's what you're asking." A soft chuckle reached her ears, but it held no mockery. "That's one way to look at it. Mind if I ask what brings a lady to Widow's Point without horse or provisions?" Mercy hesitated, weighing her options. She could lie, invent some story about being thrown from her mount or separated from a traveling party. But something in the stranger's voice suggested he'd see through any deception. And besides, what did she have left to lose? "My kin decided I wasn't worth keeping around anymore," she said, lifting her chin with the same defiance that had driven 3 generations of Callahan women. "Figured the desert might have different ideas about my worth." The silence stretched between them, broken only by the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. Mercy could feel the stranger's eyes studying her, taking in details she couldn't see, The equality of her clothes, the way she held herself, the careful manner in which her gaze fixed on a point just past his left shoulder. "You're blind," he said finally, and it wasn't a question. "2 winters now," she confirmed. "Accident with a spooked stallion. Kicked me in the head and took my sight, but apparently not my appetite or my need for winter feed. Made me an expensive mouth to feed according to my loving family." Another pause, longer this time. When the stranger spoke again, his voice had taken on a harder edge. "What kind of men leave a blind woman to die in the desert?" "The kind that share my blood, apparently." Mercy's fingers worked at a loose thread on her sleeve, a nervous habit she'd developed since losing her sight. "Uncle Jeremiah said it was Mercy. Claimed I'd never survive another winter anyway. Cousin Boyd was more direct, said putting down a crippled animal was kinder than watching it suffer." The sound of spurs rang softly as the stranger shifted his weight. "Your family's got a peculiar understanding of mercy, miss. Mind sharing your name?" "Mercy Callahan." She paused, waiting for recognition that didn't come. "Though I suppose that name doesn't carry much weight anymore, seeing as how I'm the last one using it with any honor." "Mercy," he repeated, as if testing the sound of it. "Seems like a cruel joke given the circumstances." "My mother chose it," Mercy said, a hint of warmth creeping into her voice for the first time. "Said mercy was the rarest gift in this world, worth more than gold or cattle. Guess she never imagined I'd be the one needing it most." The stranger was quiet for so long that Mercy began to wonder if he'd slipped away as silently as he'd arrived. Then she heard the soft thud of something hitting the ground near her feet. A water skin, judging by the slosh of liquid inside. "Name's Ezra Cade," he said, "and I've got different ideas about Mercy than your family does." Mercy's fingers found the water skin, noting its weight and the quality of the leather. This wasn't some cast-off provision, but a valuable piece of equipment, well-maintained and nearly full. Her throat was already burning with thirst, but she forced herself to drink sparingly. "Why?" she asked, capping the water skin after a few small sips. "You don't know me from Eve. For all you know, my family had good reason to leave me here." "Maybe they did," Ezra admitted. "But a man's character isn't measured by how he treats those who can help him. It's measured by how he treats those who can't. And right now, you can't help anybody, which makes helping you the only decent thing to do." The words hit Mercy harder than she expected. Bringing tears, she quickly blinked away. It had been so long since someone had spoken to her as if she were worth something, worth the effort of basic human kindness. "I can't pay you," she said quietly. "Lost everything when I lost my sight. Uncle Jeremiah made sure of that. Wasn't asking for payment." The sound of Ezra settling onto the ground nearby reached her ears, followed by the rustle of cloth and the creak of leather. "Tell me about this accident. How'd a Callahan woman end up getting kicked by a horse?" Mercy found herself smiling despite everything. "You know the Callahan name?" "Know it well enough. Your father was Marcus Callahan, ran the Double C spread, north of Broken Mesa. Good man, fair dealer, never met a Mustang he couldn't break or a hand he wouldn't help in a pinch." The tears came freely now, and Mercy didn't try to stop them. It had been over a year since anyone had spoken of her father with respect, since anyone had remembered him for the man he'd been, rather than the burden his disabled daughter had become. "Papa always said the wildest horses make the best mounts, if you can earn their trust," she managed through her tears. "There was this black stallion, Diablo, mean as sin and twice as smart. Papa spent months working with him, making progress inch by inch. I thought I could help, thought I understood horses the way he did. But Diablo had different ideas. Diablo had been hurt before, beaten by someone who should have known better. I moved too fast, got too close before he was ready to trust. One moment I was reaching for his halter, the next I was waking up in Doc Henderson's office 3 days later, and the world had gone dark forever." Ezra was quiet, but she could sense him listening with the full attention of someone who understood that some stories needed to be told completely before they could be properly understood. "Papa never blamed me," Mercy continued. "Said the horse was just protecting himself the only way he knew how. But after Papa died, Uncle Jeremiah saw things differently. Said I was fool enough to get myself kicked. I was fool enough to be nothing but trouble from then on." The sun had reached its peak, now beating down mercilessly on the rocky outcropping. Mercy could feel sweat beading on her forehead, but the presence of another human being, someone who didn't see her as a burden to be discarded, made the heat bearable. "What happened to Diablo?" Ezra asked. "Shot him the day after my accident. Uncle Jeremiah said he was too dangerous to keep around." Mercy's voice hardened. Funny how quickly he decided the same thing about me. A new sound reached her ears, the distant whinny of a horse, followed by the jingle of bridle hardware. Ezra's mount, probably getting restless in the heat. The reality of the situation settled over her again like a heavy blanket. This stranger had his own life to get back to, his own destination to reach. She couldn't expect him to sacrifice his plans for a woman he'd just met, no matter how dire her circumstances. "You've got somewhere to be," she said, trying to keep the disappointment out of her voice. "I appreciate the water and the kindness, Mr. Cade, but I won't ask you to do more than that." "You're not asking," Ezra replied, and she heard the sound of him getting to his feet. "I'm offering. Question is, are you brave enough to accept help from a stranger, or are you planning to sit here and prove your family right about giving up?" The challenge in his words sparked something in Mercy that had been dormant since her accident. The fighting spirit that had made Callahan women legendary for their stubbornness and their refusal to back down from any challenge. "What exactly are you offering?" she asked, rising to her own feet with careful dignity. "A chance," Ezra said simply. "A chance to prove that losing your sight doesn't mean losing your worth. A chance to show that mercy isn't just something you need. It's something you can give." The sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted them, but these weren't the measured steps of Ezra's mount. Multiple horses were coming from the south, moving fast and with purpose. Mercy's blood chilled as she recognized the rhythm. She'd heard it countless times during roundups and cattle drives. "Company coming," Ezra said, his voice taking on a sharp edge. "And judging by the way they're riding, they're not looking to pass the time of day." Mercy's hand found her knife again, though she knew it would be useless against mounted men. "How many?" "3, maybe 4. Riding hard like they're chasing something." A pause, then Ezra's voice grew grim. "Or someone." The hoofbeats grew louder, accompanied now by the sound of shouting voices. Mercy couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. Angry men on the hunt, men who'd found what they were looking for. "Well, well," a familiar voice called out as the riders reined in their mounts. "Look what we got here." Mercy's heart sank as she recognized the speaker, Cousin Boyd, his voice carrying the same cruel satisfaction it had held when he'd argued. For leaving her in the desert. The family had come back, but not to rescue her. They'd come to make sure she was dead. The desert air crackled with tension as Boyd Callahan's laughter echoed off the rocks. Mercy's fingers traced the worn wooden cross beside her, anchoring herself to something solid as her world tilted toward nightmare. The familiar scent of her. Cousin's bay gelding mixed with sweat and leather, bringing back memories of family gatherings that now felt like poison in her throat. "Thought you might have crawled off somewhere to die by now," Boyd called out, his voice carrying the same mock concern he'd used when arguing for her abandonment. "But here you are, pretty as a picture and twice as useless." Ezra's boots shifted. In the gravel, a subtle sound that spoke of coiled readiness. Mercy had learned to read the language of men's movements, the way their weight settled before violence, the rhythm of their breathing when anger built like storm clouds. Whatever Boyd intended, Ezra was preparing for it. Seems your cousins. Got company, another voice added. Uncle Jeremiah, his words slurred with whiskey despite the early hour. Stranger, you best mount up and ride. This here's family business. The desert wind carried the metallic click of gun hammers being thumbed back, 3 distinct sounds, which meant at least one man had 2 weapons drawn. Mercy's throat constricted as she realized Ezra was outnumbered and outgunned by men who'd already proven they valued life about as much as last week's newspaper. Family business, Ezra repeated, his voice carrying a dangerous quiet that made the hair on Mercy's arms stand up. That what you call abandoning a blind woman in the desert? Boyd's horse snorted and danced sideways, responding to its rider's tension. Call it whatever you want, stranger. Girl's been nothing but trouble since she lost her sight. Eating our food, taking up space, scaring off decent suitors with her witch eyes. The words hit Mercy like physical blows, each one finding the tender. Places where her confidence used to live. She'd heard variations of these accusations whispered around campfires and spoken openly after her father's funeral, but having them thrown at her in front of a stranger felt like being stripped naked in a snowstorm. Witch eyes, Ezra said, and something in his tone made even the horses grow still. That's an interesting phrase from a man who's about to find out what real witchcraft looks like. The silence stretched taut as a bowstring. Mercy could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears, could smell the acrid tang of fear sweat mixing with dust and sage. Somewhere in the distance a hawk cried out, its voice the only clean sound in a moment poisoned by human cruelty. Big. Untalk for a man staring down 3 guns, Uncle Jeremiah growled. You got a death wish, boy? Just a different perspective on what's worth dying for, Ezra replied. See, I've killed men before. Some deserved it, some didn't, but I've never killed a man for showing kindness to someone who needed it. Today might be the day I start. The threat hung in the air like smoke from a grass fire. Mercy felt something shift in the atmosphere around them. A subtle change in the way the men held themselves, the way their horses responded to barely perceptible signals. Violence was coming, she could taste it on the desert wind. Mercy, Ezra said quietly, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade through silk. When I give the word, you drop flat and stay down. Don't matter what you hear, don't matter how long it takes. You stay down until I tell you otherwise. Her mouth went dry as parchment. Ezra, 3 men, he continued as if she hadn't spoken. 2 rifles, 1 pistol, the one with the pistols drunk, his hands shaking. The rifles are steady, but they're both pointed at me, not you. That's their first mistake. Boyd's nervous laughter cracked like a whip. You planning to talk us to death, stranger? Just letting the lady know what's about to happen, Ezra replied. Seems fair, since your family's been making decisions for her without bothering to ask her opinion. The truth of those words settled over Mercy like a heavy blanket. Her entire life had been shaped by other people's choices. Her father's decision to work with dangerous horses, her uncle's decision to see her as a burden, her cousin's decision that she wasn't worth keeping alive. Now, a stranger was about to risk his life based on his own decision about her value. I won't be responsible for your death, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. You're not responsible for anything that happens here, Ezra replied. These men made their choices when they left you to die. I'm making mine by standing between them and finishing the job. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. A new sound reached Mercy's ears, the soft whisper of metal sliding against leather. Ezra was drawing his weapon, the movement so smooth and quiet it seemed more like a magician's trick than a gunfighter's preparation. The desert held its breath. Last chance to ride away, Ezra said, his voice carrying the finality of a judge pronouncing sentence. Take it, and we'll pretend this conversation never happened. Like hell, Boyd snarled. That girl's a Callahan, and Callahans clean up their own messes. She should have died with her daddy instead of lingering on like some half-dead. The first gunshot cracked like thunder, followed immediately by Boyd's scream of pain and rage. Mercy pressed herself against the rocky ground as chaos erupted around her, horses neighing in terror, men shouting, the rapid bark of gunfire that seemed to come from all directions at once. A second shot, then a third, each one sharp and decisive. The acrid smell of gunpowder burned her nostrils as something heavy hit the ground nearby with a wet thud. One of the horses bolted, its hoofbeats fading rapidly into the distance. Jesus Christ, Uncle Jeremiah's voice, high and tight with pain. My hand! He shot my goddamn hand! The gunfire stopped as suddenly as it had begun, leaving only the sound of labored breathing and the soft moans of wounded men. Mercy remained pressed against the rocks, her body trembling with shock and adrenaline, afraid to move or speak or even breathe too loudly. Mercy, Ezra's voice, calm and steady despite what had just happened. You can sit up now. It's over. She raised herself on shaking arms, her unseeing eyes wide with disbelief. Are they alive? Ezra confirmed, though they'll be eating with their left hands for a while. Amazing how a bullet through the gun hand changes a man's perspective on violence. The smell of blood was stronger now, mixing with dust and sweat and the lingering tang of gunpowder. Mercy could hear her family members moving around, cursing and groaning as they dealt with their wounds. Uncle Jeremiah was making small whimpering, sounds that would have been pathetic if he hadn't just been trying to kill her. You're insane, Boyd gasped, his voice thick with pain and rage. You know what you've done. You know who we are. I know exactly who you are, Ezra replied, his voice carrying a cold edge that made Mercy shiver. You're the kind of men who abandon a blind woman in the desert and then come back to make sure she's dead. You're the kind of men who mistake cruelty for strength and cowardice for practicality. The sound of boots on gravel told Mercy that Ezra was moving, probably checking on the wounded men. She could hear him working with practiced efficiency, his movements suggesting familiarity with battlefield medicine. This is temporary, he said, apparently addressing her family. Pressure bandages to stop the bleeding. You'll live, assuming. You're smart enough to head straight to the nearest doctor instead of trying something else stupid. This ain't over, Boyd wheezed. You can't watch her every minute of every day. Soon as you turn your back, the sound of a gun being cocked cut him off mid-sentence. See, that's where you're wrong, Ezra said, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than a shout. I can watch her every minute of every day. It's what I do. And if I ever see any of you within 100 miles of her, again, I won't be aiming for your hands. The threat hung in the desert air like heat shimmer, visible in its intensity. Mercy could practically feel her family's fear, could hear it in their quick, shallow breathing, and the way they shifted nervously, despite their injuries. Mount up, Ezra commanded. All of you, head for town and don't look back. The sounds of wounded men struggling to climb onto horses filled the air. Mercy listened to her family's departure with a mixture of relief and sadness that surprised her. These were the people who'd raised her after her parents died, who'd shared meals and stories and Christmas mornings. Now they were riding away like strangers, and she knew she'd never see them again. Not that she could see them anyway. The irony of that thought almost made her laugh, but the sound that came out was closer to a sob. She was alone again. But this time with a man who'd just proved he was willing to kill for her. She wasn't sure if that made her safer or more terrified. They're gone, Ezra said quietly, settling down beside her on the rocky ground. And they won't be back. How can you be sure? Because men like that are bullies at heart. They only fight when they think they can win without getting hurt. Today taught them different. Mercy nodded, but her hands were still shaking. The violence had been so sudden, so overwhelming, that she felt like she was still falling from a great height, with no idea when she'd hit the ground. You could have been killed, she whispered. Could have, Ezra agreed. But I wasn't, sometimes. That's how it works. Why? The question burst out of her before she could stop it. Why risk your life for someone you just met? Someone who can't even see your face or help you if things go wrong? Ezra was quiet for a long moment, and Mercy could hear him shifting positions, probably looking out over the desert where her family had disappeared. My sister was born simple, he said finally. Sweet as honey, but her mind never grew past that. Of a child. Our father saw her as a burden, a mouth to feed that would never contribute anything useful. When she was 16, he decided she'd be better off in an asylum. Mercy's breath caught in her throat. I was away, working a cattle drive in Colorado. By the time I got home, she was gone. Found her 3 months later in a place that wasn't fit for animals, let alone a gentle girl who'd never hurt anyone in. Her life. The pain in his voice was so raw that Mercy felt it like a physical ache in her chest. She died that winter, Ezra continued. Pneumonia, they said. But I knew better. She died of abandonment, of being thrown away by the people who should have protected her. The desert wind whispered around them, carrying the scent of sage and the promise of another scorching day. I swore that day I'd never let it happen again, Ezra said. Never let someone defenseless be thrown away because they didn't fit someone else's idea of useful. Mercy felt tears sliding down her cheeks, hot and unexpected. I'm sorry. Don't. Be sorry for me, Ezra replied. Be sorry for the men who just rode away, because they'll never know what they lost when they decided you weren't worth keeping. The words hit her like a physical blow, but a gentle one, like being caught by strong arms instead of hitting the ground. For the first time since her accident, someone was telling her she had value not despite her blindness, but as the complete person she was. What happens now? She asked. Now, Ezra said, getting to his feet, we get you somewhere safe. Somewhere you can figure out who you want to be instead of letting other people decide for you. The sound of his horse approaching reached her ears, followed by the creak of leather as he adjusted the saddle. Can you ride? He asked. Mercy almost laughed. I've been riding since before I could walk. Losing my sight didn't change that. Good, Ezra said, and she could hear the smile in his voice. Because we've got a long way to go, and I don't fancy walking across the desert carrying you. For the first time in months, Mercy felt something that might have been hope-stirring. In her chest. She didn't know where they were going or what would happen when they got there, but for the first time since her accident, she was moving forward instead of just surviving. And sometimes that was enough. The horse beneath Mercy was a revelation. Where she had expected awkwardness and fear, she found herself settling into the familiar rhythm of movement that had been her birthright before darkness claimed her world. The mare, Ezra called her, Sage, had a gentle gait and an intuitive way of adjusting her stride when Mercy's balance wavered. They'd been riding for 2 hours across terrain that rose and fell like a sea of stone and sand. Mercy could feel the sun's position changing overhead, could smell water somewhere ahead, mixing with the dusty scent of mesquite and palo verde. But it was the silence that unnerved her most. Not the natural quiet of the desert, but the heavy weight of unspoken thoughts between her and the man who'd saved her life. Your shoulder's bleeding, she said finally, unable to bear the tension any longer. Ezra's saddle creaked as he shifted positions. Just a graze. Boyd's aim was about as steady as his moral compass. You lied back there. The words came out sharper than she'd intended. About the gunfight being over clean. One of them got you. A pause, long enough that Mercy began to wonder if he'd heard her. Then came the soft sound of fabric tearing, followed by Ezra's quiet curse. Shoulder wounds bleed like hell, he admitted. But it's not deep, I've had worse. How much worse? Mercy asked, surprised by her own boldness. And don't lie to me again. I may be blind, but I'm not stupid. Another pause. This one filled with something that might have been amusement. Army gave me plenty of practice getting shot at. Spent 3 years chasing Apaches through country that made today's desert look like a garden party. The revelation hit Mercy like cold water. An Army scout would explain his shooting skills, his easy familiarity with violence, the way he'd read the situation with her family like words on a page. But it also raised new questions that made her stomach clench. With uncertainty, "Is that what this is?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Some kind of mission for you? Rescuing helpless women to make up for whatever happened in the war?" The horses stopped abruptly. Mercy felt Sage's muscles tense beneath her as Ezra reined in his mount somewhere to her left. The desert around them fell silent, except for the distant call of a roadrunner and the soft wheeze of Ezra's breathing. "Get down," he said, his voice flat and hard. "What?" "Get down off the horse. Now." Mercy's hands trembled as she dismounted, her feet finding rocky ground that sloped downward toward what sounded like running water. She could hear Ezra moving around her, his boots scraping against stone, but she couldn't tell if he was angry, or hurt, or planning to abandon her here like her family had. "Sit," he commanded, and she heard him settling onto the ground nearby. The silence stretched between them like a taut rope. Mercy wrapped her arms around her knees and waited, her heart hammering against her ribs as she tried to prepare herself for whatever was coming. "You want to know about the war?" Ezra's voice came from somewhere to her right, closer than she'd expected. "Fine. I'll tell you about the war." She heard him moving again, probably tending to his wounded shoulder. The sound of water being poured was followed by another muttered curse. "Apache called us pony soldiers," he continued. "Thought we were fools for riding horses into their country, trying to fight them with cavalry tactics in terrain that favored quick feet over fast horses." A hawk cried overhead, its voice sharp against the desert sky. "They were right. Lost half my unit in the first 6 months, good men who trusted their officers to know what they were doing. The Apache knew every rock, every canyon, every water hole. We knew how to march in formation and die with our boots on." Mercy could hear pain in his voice now, not physical, but something deeper, older. The kind of pain that came from carrying the weight of other people's deaths. "There was this one fight," Ezra said, his voice growing quieter. "Canyon ambush, classic Apache tactics. We rode right into it like greenhorns on their first cattle. And drive. By the time the shooting stopped, I was the only one left breathing." "How did you survive?" Mercy asked, though part of her wasn't sure she wanted to know. "Because I learned to think like them, instead of like a soldier. Learned to read the land, to listen to what the desert was telling me. Learned that sometimes the best way to win a fight is to not fight it at all." The explanation settled over Mercy like a heavy blanket. Everything about Ezra's behavior suddenly made sense. His ability to read her family's intentions, his tactical thinking during the gunfight, his instinctive understanding of how to survive in hostile territory. "Is that what I am to you?" she asked. "Another tactical situation to resolve." "No." The answer came without hesitation. "You're a woman who deserves better than what life's handed her. You're someone who's been written off by people who should have known better. And you're brave enough to ask hard questions, even when you might not like the answers." Mercy felt tears threatening again, but these were different from the ones she'd shed earlier. These carried hope instead of despair, possibility instead of resignation. "I can't see your face," she said quietly. "Can't tell if you're lying or telling the truth. All I have is your voice, and the way you move, and the choices you make. What do those things tell you?" Mercy considered the question seriously, thinking about everything she'd observed since he'd found her at Widow's Point. The careful way he moved, suggesting controlled strength, the measured quality of his speech, indicating a man who thought before he spoke, the willingness to risk his life for a stranger, pointing to a moral compass that didn't waver under pressure. "They tell me you're a good man carrying a heavy load," she said finally. They tell me you've seen enough death to value life, enough cruelty to recognize kindness. They tell me I can trust you, even if I don't understand why you're helping me." The sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted them before Ezra could respond. Multiple horses, moving at a steady pace, rather than the frantic gallop that had brought her family to Widow's Point. Mercy tensed, her hand instinctively moving toward the knife at her belt. "Easy," Ezra said quietly. "These aren't your cousins coming back for another try." "How can you tell? Different horses, different riders. These are moving like they know where they're going instead of hunting for something they lost." The hoofbeats grew closer, accompanied now by the creak of leather and the soft jingle of metal. Mercy counted at least 4 horses, maybe 5, their riders maintaining a formation that spoke of military training or professional experience. "Ezra Cade," a voice called out as the riders approached. "Thought we might find you out here." "Sheriff Morrison," Ezra replied, and Mercy could hear him getting to his feet. "You're a long way from town. Got word there was shooting out at Widow's Point. 3 wounded men rode into Doc Peterson's office this morning, all shot through the gun hands. They were spinning quite a tale about a crazy gunfighter and a blind woman." Mercy's stomach clenched as she realized the implications. Her family had reached town, had told their version of events to the law. Whatever story they'd concocted probably painted her as the villain, and Ezra as a dangerous drifter who'd attacked innocent men. "I imagine they did," Ezra said calmly. "Men like that usually have creative explanations for their injuries." "They claim you shot them down in cold blood," Sheriff Morrison continued. "Say you were working with the woman to rob them, used her blindness as a distraction while you got the drop on them." The accusation hung in the desert air like smoke from a grass fire. Mercy felt the familiar weight of helplessness settling over her shoulders, the crushing certainty that she would be blamed for things beyond her control. "That's not what happened," she said, finding her voice despite her fear. "Ma'am," the sheriff replied, his tone polite but skeptical, "I'll need to hear your version of events. But first, I need to know if you're being held against your will." The question caught Mercy off guard. She'd been so focused on defending Ezra that she hadn't considered how their situation might look to outsiders. A blind woman traveling alone with an armed stranger who'd just shot 3 men. "No," she said firmly. "Mr. Cade saved my life. My family left me to die in the desert, and he found me. When they came back to—" She paused, struggling with the words. "When they came back to finish what they'd started, he defended me." "That's a serious accusation, Mom. You're saying your own kin tried to murder you?" Mercy lifted her chin with the same defiance that had sustained her through 2 years of blindness and months of cruel treatment. "I'm saying they left a blind woman alone in the desert, without water or provisions, 40 miles from the nearest town. If that's not attempted murder, Sheriff, then what would you call it?" Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The silence that followed was broken only by the restless movement of horses and the distant sound of water flowing over stone. Mercy could feel the weight of multiple pairs of eyes studying her, measuring her credibility against the story they'd already heard. "Ezra," Sheriff Morrison said finally, "you want to tell me your side of this?" "Simple enough," Ezra replied. "Found Miss Callahan at Widow's Point this morning, abandoned without supplies. While we were talking, 3 armed men showed up claiming to be her family. They made it clear they intended to kill her to keep their family's shame from spreading. And you just happened to be faster than all 3 of them? I've had practice." The sheriff's horse snorted and shifted, responding to its rider's tension. "That's what worries me, Ezra. You're too good with that gun for a simple drifter. Makes a man wonder what else you might be running from." Mercy felt the situation slipping away from them like sand through her fingers. The sheriff clearly knew Ezra's reputation was suspicious of his motives, and she was just a blind woman with no witnesses to support her story against three men who'd probably spun a convincing tale of victimhood. "Sheriff," she said, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade, "before you decide who's telling the truth, maybe you should ask yourself why three grown men would need to shoot a blind woman instead of just leaving her alone. Ma'am, if their story is true, if Mr. Cade really was robbing them, why didn't they just ride away? Why risk their lives fighting an armed man over a woman they claim is worthless?" Mercy paused, letting the logic of her words sink in. "Unless, of course, they came back to Widow's Point for the same reason they left me there in the first place, because they saw me as a problem that needed to be permanently solved." The desert wind whispered around them, carrying the scent of distant rain and the promise of a storm building somewhere beyond the horizon. Mercy could feel the balance of the moment shifting, could sense the sheriff reconsidering the situation. In light of her words, "That's an interesting point," Morrison admitted, "but it still doesn't explain why Ezra here was so quick to get involved in family business that wasn't his concern. Because some things transcend family business," Ezra said quietly. "Some things are just right or wrong, regardless of blood relations. And leaving a blind woman to die in the desert is wrong, no matter what story you tell yourself to justify it." "Noble sentiment," the sheriff replied. "But the law isn't always about noble sentiments. Sometimes it's about keeping the peace and making sure justice gets served." Mercy felt her heart sinking as she realized where this was heading. The sheriff wasn't interested in the truth. He was interested in maintaining order and avoiding complications. Three wounded men claiming to be victims were easier to deal with than a complex story about family betrayal and moral choices. "So what happens now?" she asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know. "Now," Sheriff Morrison said, "we all ride back to town. There'll be a hearing, testimony taken, facts sorted out. Justice will be served one way or another." But as they prepared to mount up for the journey to town, Mercy couldn't shake the feeling that justice and truth weren't necessarily the same thing. And in a world where she'd already been abandoned by her own blood, she wasn't sure she could trust the law to protect her any better than her family had. The storm clouds were building on the horizon, and Mercy had the sinking feeling that the real tempest was still ahead of them. The jail cell smelled of unwashed bodies, stale tobacco, and something else Mercy couldn't identify but made her stomach turn. She sat on the narrow cot, her fingers tracing the rough wool blanket while listening to the sounds of broken mesas. Evening routine filtering through the barred window above her head. Children playing in the street, a woman calling for her husband to come to supper, the distant lowing of cattle being driven to water. Normal sounds. The sounds of people living normal lives while she sat locked away like a criminal. Miss Callahan? The voice belonged to a young man, probably the deputy sheriff she'd heard moving around outside her cell for the past hour. "There's someone here to see you." The sound of keys jangling was followed by heavy footsteps approaching. Mercy tensed, expecting Sheriff Morrison or perhaps a lawyer, but the scent that reached her was distinctly feminine. Lavender soap mixed with something medicinal. "My name is Ruth Peterson," the woman said, settling onto the cot beside Mercy, with a soft rustle of skirts. "I'm the doctor's wife. I wanted to meet the woman who's got this whole town talking." Mercy's hands clenched in her lap. "I imagine they're saying all sorts of charitable things about the blind girl who got a good man shot." "Actually," Ruth said, her voice carrying a warmth that surprised Mercy, "most folks are asking why the Callahan men came to town with bullet holes in their hands, spinning tales about being robbed by a woman who can't see past her own nose." The unexpected support caught Mercy off guard. She'd spent the last 3 hours in this cell, assuming the entire town had already judged her guilty based on her family's version of events. "You don't believe them?" Ruth was quiet for a moment, and Mercy could hear her shifting positions on the narrow cot. When she spoke again, her voice carried a hardness that hadn't been there before. "Honey, I've been patching up the victims of men's cruelty for 20 years. I know the difference between a man who's been shot defending himself and one who's been shot doing something he shouldn't. Your cousin Boyd. He's got powder burns on his gun hand that tell a very different story than the one he's been telling." Mercy's breath caught. "Powder burns?" "Close-range shooting, the kind you get when you draw on someone and they're faster than you expected." Ruth's hand found Mercy's shoulder, a gentle touch that somehow conveyed both comfort and strength. "Your Mr. K didn't ambush anybody. He outgunned 3 men who were planning to kill you." The relief that flooded through Mercy was so intense it made her dizzy. Someone believed her. Someone had looked at the evidence instead of just listening. "To accusations. Where is he?" Mercy asked. "Ezra, I mean. They won't tell me anything. Sheriff's got him in the back cell, keeping him separated from the general population. Smart move, considering half the men in this town have heard stories about his gun work and are itching to test themselves against him." The casual mention of Ezra's reputation sent a chill down Mercy's spine. "What kind of stories?" Ruth hesitated, and in that pause Mercy heard more than she wanted to know. Whatever Ezra's past contained, it was darker than he'd let on during their conversations. "The kind that makes smart men nervous and stupid men ambitious," Ruth said finally. "But that's not why I'm here. I came to tell you that you've got friends in this town. People who remember your father and what kind of man he was." "Papa's been dead 2 years," Mercy said quietly. "People forget. Some do. Others remember that Marcus Callahan never cheated. A man in his life, never turned away someone who needed help, never let his word be worth less than gold." Ruth's voice grew stronger. "They remember that kind of integrity, especially when they see his daughter carrying herself with the same dignity despite everything that's been done to her." Mercy felt tears threatening, but these were clean tears, honest ones that came from gratitude rather than grief. For so long she'd felt like a burden, a mistake, a problem to be solved or discarded. To hear that someone saw her father's legacy in her actions was like finding water in the desert. "What's going to happen?" she asked. "To me, to Ezra?" "That depends on a lot of things," Ruth admitted. "Judge Hartwell's due in town tomorrow for the monthly circuit court. He's a fair man, but he's also practical. He'll want to resolve this quickly and quietly." The sound of boots in the corridor interrupted their conversation, heavy, measured steps that spoke of authority and purpose. Sheriff Morrison appeared outside the cell, his weathered face unreadable in the lamplight. "Mrs. Peterson, I need to ask you to finish up your visit. Got business to discuss with Miss Callahan." Ruth squeezed Mercy's hand before standing. "Remember what I told you, honey. You're not alone in this." As Ruth's footsteps faded down the corridor, Sheriff Morrison pulled up a wooden chair and settled into it with a soft grunt. The smell of coffee and tobacco smoke clung to him, mixing with the leather of his gun belt and the wool of his vest. "Miss Callahan," he began, his voice carrying the weight of official business, "I've been doing some checking into your story. Talked to folks who knew your family, looked into the circumstances of your father's death." Mercy waited, her hands folded in her lap, trying to read the sheriff's tone for clues about what he'd discovered. "Seems your Uncle Jeremiah's been having money troubles since your father died. Lost a good portion of the Callahan herd to rustlers last spring, mortgaged the ranch to cover his gambling debts. Word is, he's been looking for ways to cut expenses." The revelation hit Mercy like a physical blow. Her father's ranch, the land that had been in the Callahan family for 2 generations, was in danger of being lost. Suddenly, her uncle's eagerness to be rid of her made terrible sense. "How much trouble?" she asked. "Enough that feeding and caring for a blind woman might seem like a luxury he couldn't afford," Morrison said bluntly. "Doesn't excuse what they did to you, but it explains it." "What?" "About Ezra. The sheriff was quiet for a long moment, and Mercy could hear him shifting in his chair, could sense his reluctance to answer. "Your friend's got a complicated past," he said finally. "Real name's Ezra Cade, just like he told you. But he left out some important details about why he's not with the army anymore." Mercy's stomach tightened with dread. What kind of details? The kind that got him court-martialed and discharged under less than honorable circumstances. Seems he had a disagreement with his commanding officer about the treatment of Apache prisoners. Disagreement ended with the officer in the hospital and Cade on the run. The words hung in the air between them like smoke from a dying fire. Mercy felt the foundation of her trust in Ezra shifting, not collapsing, but changing shape as new information forced her to reconsider everything she thought she knew about him. "He never hurt me," she said quietly. "Never threatened me, never made me feel unsafe. Whatever he did in the army, it doesn't change the fact that he saved my life." "Maybe not," Morrison agreed. "But it does complicate things. Judge Hartwell's not going to be sympathetic to a man with a violent past, especially one who's already demonstrated his willingness to settle disputes with gunfire." The rope around Mercy's wrists bit into her skin as rough hands shoved her forward through the jail's back door. The night air hit her face like a slap, carrying the acrid smell of burning wood and the sound of an angry crowd that had grown from a few dozen voices to what sounded like half the town. Their shouts crashed over her in waves, demands for justice, calls for blood, the kind of primal anger that turned civilized people into something else entirely. "Move!" the man behind her grunted, his whiskey-soaked breath hot against her ear. Folks are getting impatient. Mercy's bare feet found wooden planks beneath them, the jail's back porch, probably, though she'd never seen it. The boards creaked ominously under the weight of multiple people, and she could hear more men gathering in the alley behind the building. Someone had organized this carefully, planned it to avoid the main street where Sheriff Morrison might interfere. "This is wrong," she said, her voice barely carrying over the crowd's noise. "I haven't had a trial. I haven't—" "Shut up," another voice snapped. "You've said enough lies already." But even as the words left her mouth, Mercy felt something shift. Inside her, the helpless girl who'd been abandoned in the desert was gone, replaced by someone who refused to die quietly. Her father's blood ran in her veins, and Marcus Callahan had never backed down from a fight, even when the odds were impossible. "If you're going to murder me," she called out, her voice rising above the crowd's roar, "at least have the courage to tell me why." The shouting died away, replaced by an uncomfortable silence. Mercy could feel their eyes on her, could sense their uncertainty in the way they shifted their weight and cleared their throats. Whatever story they'd been told to justify this lynching, it apparently didn't hold up well under direct questioning. "You know why?" someone finally called from the safety of the crowd. "You and that killer brought trouble to our town." "What trouble?" Mercy demanded, her voice gaining strength. "A blind woman asking for help? 3 men getting shot because they tried to finish what they started in the desert?" "Enough talking," the man holding her arm said, but there was less conviction in his voice now. "Let's get this done." The sound of a door slamming open cut through the night air, followed by heavy footsteps and the unmistakable authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "What in hell is going on here?" Sheriff Morrison's voice cracked like a whip, causing several of the men around Mercy to step back instinctively. "Just taking care of business, Sheriff," someone replied, though the defiance in his tone was forced. "Business? You seemed reluctant to handle yourself." "Business?" Morrison's boots rang against the wooden planks as he approached. "You call dragging a woman out of jail in the middle of the night business? Who's the sorry excuse for a man leading this circus?" Mercy heard whispered conversations, the sound of blame being passed from one person to another. Whoever had organized this mob was smart enough to stay anonymous, letting others take the risk while he remained safely in the shadows. "Sheriff," Mercy said, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her chest. "They're planning to hang me, without a trial, without evidence, without anything but the word of men who left me to die in the desert." The silence that followed was broken only by the distant sound of a church bell tolling midnight. In that moment, Mercy realized that Morrison faced the same choice Ezra had faced at Widow's Point: stand up for what was right, or let injustice proceed unchallenged. "Cut her loose," Morrison ordered, his voice carrying the weight of final authority. "All of you go home. This ends now." "Like hell it does," a new voice called from the back of the crowd. "We've got rights too, Sheriff. Rights to protect our town from killers and troublemakers." Mercy recognized the voice. Boyd Callahan. His words slightly slurred, but carrying the confidence of a man who thought he held the moral high ground. Her cousin had managed to rally the town against her, turning her from victim to villain through whatever lies he'd spread. "Boyd," Morrison said, his tone taking on a dangerous edge. "Your gun hand giving you trouble tonight? Maybe you should be home resting instead of stirring up lynch mobs." "My gun hand's fine," Boyd replied, though Mercy could hear the defensive note in his voice. "Fine enough to do what needs doing if the law won't." The crowd stirred restlessly, feeding off the confrontation between the sheriff and her cousin. Mercy could feel the situation balanced on a knife's edge, ready to tip toward violence at the slightest provocation. "You want to know what needs doing?" Morrison's voice dropped to a whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the alley. "What needs doing is for you to explain why 3 grown men needed guns to deal with a blind woman. What needs doing is for you to tell these folks why you left your own blood to die in the desert like a rabid dog." "She's not our blood anymore," Boyd snapped, his control finally cracking. "Hasn't been since she lost her sight and started eating our food without contributing anything useful. We gave her 2 years of charity, Sheriff, 2 years of feeding and clothing and caring for someone who couldn't pull her own weight." The raw cruelty in his words hit Mercy like a physical blow, but it also revealed something important. Boyd was angry, defensive, justifying his actions to himself as much as to the crowd. Men who were truly righteous didn't need to explain their righteousness so loudly. "Charity," Morrison repeated, his voice flat with disgust. "That's what you call family obligation? That's what you call Christian decency?" "Christian decency doesn't extend to keeping deadweight around forever," Boyd replied. "Ask anyone here. They'll tell you the same thing. A blind woman's got no place on a working ranch, no value to anyone except as a mouth to feed." The words hung in the night air like poison, and Mercy felt something inside her snap. The last vestige of the helpless girl who'd tried to please everyone, who'd accepted blame for things beyond her control, died in that moment. "You're right," she said, her voice cutting through the darkness with surprising clarity. "I'm blind. I can't see your faces, can't read your expressions, can't tell who's lying and who's telling the truth by looking at them." The sound of raised voices from the street outside drew Morrison's attention. Mercy could hear men shouting, though she couldn't make out the words. The sheriff stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the stone floor. "Stay put," he ordered, though Mercy almost laughed at the absurdity of the command. Where exactly did he think she was going to go? As Morrison's footsteps receded, Mercy found herself alone with her thoughts for the first time since her arrest. The silence of the jail was different from the silence of the desert, heavier, more oppressive, filled with the weight of other people's desperation and fear. She thought about Ezra, locked in a cell somewhere behind her, carrying secrets that made him dangerous in the eyes of the law. She thought about her father's ranch, slowly bleeding away under the weight of her uncle's failures and vices. She thought about Ruth Peterson's kindness, about the possibility that not everyone in the world saw her as a burden to be discarded. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you're enjoying it, Subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The voices outside grew louder, more agitated. Mercy could make out individual words now. Murderer, justice, hanging. Her blood ran cold as she realized what was happening. A mob was forming, and they weren't interested in waiting for Judge Hartwell's verdict. The sound of breaking glass reached her ears, followed by more shouting and the thunder of running feet. Someone was organizing. The crowd, directing their anger toward a specific target. Mercy pressed herself against the back wall of her cell, her heart hammering against her ribs as she realized how quickly civilized law and order could dissolve into something much more primitive and dangerous. Heavy footsteps returned to the corridor, but these weren't Morrison's measured strides. Multiple men were approaching, their boots ringing against the stone floor with the urgency of people who'd made a decision and wouldn't be turned from it. "Miss Callahan?" The voice was unfamiliar, rough with whiskey and anger. "You in there?" Mercy remained silent, hoping they might pass by if she didn't respond, but the sound of keys jingling told her that silence wouldn't save her. Someone had convinced the deputy to hand over access to the cells, either through persuasion or force. "Come on out, miss," the voice continued, closer now. "Time to face what you've done." The cell door swung open with a metallic screech that seemed to echo through Mercy's bones. She could smell the crowd now, sweat and alcohol and the particular odor of men who'd worked themselves into a righteous fury. Their breathing was labored, excited like hunting dogs that had finally cornered their prey. "Please," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I haven't done anything wrong." "Haven't done anything wrong?" The speaker laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You got a good man shot, brought trouble to our town, stirred up all kinds of problems with your lies and accusations." Hands grabbed her arms, pulling her to her feet with rough efficiency. Mercy stumbled, her legs weak from hours of sitting in the cramped cell, but the men holding her showed no patience for her disorientation. "Where are you taking me?" she asked, though part of her didn't want to know the answer. "Justice," someone said from behind her. "Real justice, not the kind that comes from judges and lawyers who don't understand what needs to be done." As they dragged her from the cell, Mercy caught the sound of something that made her blood freeze in her veins, the creak of rope being stretched taut, the particular sound that every Westerner knew meant only one thing. They were going to hang her, and somewhere in the back of the jail, Ezra was probably next. The crowd had gone silent, everyone straining to hear what she would say next. "But I can hear the fear in your voices," Mercy continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I can smell the whiskey on your breath and the cowardice in your sweat. I can feel the way you huddle together in the dark, hiding behind each other because you're too ashamed to face what you're planning to do." "Shut her up," someone called, but the voice lacked conviction. "You want to hang me because it's easier than admitting you were wrong." Mercy pressed on, her father's courage flowing through her like fire. "Easier than facing the fact that you believed the lies of men who abandoned their own kin. Easier than asking yourselves what kind of people you've become." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The sound of approaching horses cut through her words. Multiple riders coming fast from the direction of the main street. The crowd began to murmur nervously, unsure whether the newcomers represented reinforcement or opposition. "That'll be the judge," Morrison announced, his voice carrying a note of satisfaction. "Judge Hartwell rode in an hour ago, heard about the commotion, and decided to hold an emergency hearing. Seems he's not too fond of lynch mobs operating in his jurisdiction." The horses reined in with a thunder of hooves and the jingle of harness leather. Mercy could hear men dismounting, their boots hitting the ground with military precision. These weren't townspeople caught up in mob fever. These were professionals, men accustomed to dealing with violence and disorder. "Sheriff Morrison, AG," New voice called, carrying the authority of education and experience. I understand we have a situation here that requires immediate attention. Judge Hartwell, Morrison replied, relief evident in his tone. Just in time to prevent a miscarriage of justice. Miscarriage nothing, Boyd protested, though his voice had lost much of its earlier confidence. We're just trying to protect our town from... From what? Judge Hartwell's voice cut through Boyd's words like a blade. From a blind woman who's committed no crime? From a man who defended her against 3 armed attackers? Or from your own guilty consciences? The crowd began to shift and murmur, their unity fracturing under the judge's direct challenge. Mercy could feel their resolve weakening, could sense them beginning to remember who they were when they weren't part of an angry mob. Everyone except the principals in this case needs to disperse, Hartwell ordered, his voice carrying the weight of legal authority. Go home. Think about what you were about to do and pray that God forgives you for it, because I certainly won't if I see any of you involved in vigilante justice again. The crowd began to break up, men slipping away into the darkness like shadows, fleeing the dawn. Within minutes, only a handful of people remained in the alley. Morrison, the judge, Boyd, and a few others who seemed too stubborn or too drunk to leave. Miss Callahan, Judge Hartwell said, his voice gentler now, I apologize for the treatment you've received tonight. This is not how justice is supposed to work in civilized society. Thank you, Your Honor, Mercy replied, her voice shaking slightly, as the adrenaline of confronting the mob began to fade. But I'm not sure civilization has much to do with what happened here tonight. Unfortunately, the judge agreed, you may be right about that, but we're going to make sure it has everything to do with what happens next. As the remaining crowd dispersed and the immediate danger passed, Mercy felt something she hadn't experienced. Since her father's death, the protection of law and order, the security that came from knowing that someone in authority was willing to stand between her and those who wished her harm. But even as relief flooded through her, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was only a temporary reprieve. Boyd had disappeared into the night, but he hadn't given up. Men like him never did. And somewhere in the jail behind her, Ezra was still locked in a cell, facing his own reckoning with a past that might be darker than she'd imagined. The night was far from over, and the morning would bring its own challenges. But for the first time since this nightmare began, Mercy felt like she might actually live to see the sunrise. That would have to be enough for now. That's enough, Judge Hartwell said before Boyd could respond. Mr. Cade, you may step down. As Ezra returned to his seat beside her, Mercy reached out and found his hand. His fingers were trembling slightly, and she realized that revealing his past had cost him more than she'd understood. He'd laid his soul bare in front of a room full of strangers, knowing it might destroy any chance they had of walking away free. Miss Callahan, the judge said, I'd like to hear your account of these events. Mercy rose on unsteady legs, her hand trailing along the furniture until she found the witness chair. The room fell silent as she settled herself, and she could feel the weight of dozens of eyes studying her, judging her, trying to decide if she was victim or villain. Your Honor, she began, her voice stronger than she'd expected, I want to tell you about 2 kinds of blindness. 2 kinds? Judge Hartwell prompted. The first kind is what happened to me 2 years ago when a horse kicked me in the head. I lost my sight, but I learned to navigate the world in new ways. I learned to listen more carefully, to feel more deeply, to understand things that sighted people often miss. She paused, gathering her courage for what came next. The second kind of blindness is what happened to my family. They became blind to my worth as a person, blind to their own cruelty, blind to the difference between burden and blessing. That blindness is worse than mine, Your Honor, because it's a choice. Mercy could hear people shifting in their seats, could sense the emotional temperature of the room changing as her words sank in. My uncle and cousin didn't abandon me because I was helpless, she continued. They abandoned me because helping me required them to be better people than they wanted to be. Mr. Cade didn't save me because I was worth saving. He saved me because saving people is who he is, regardless of the cost to himself." "And what would you have this court do?" Judge Hartwell asked. "I would have this court see clearly, Your Honor, see that the real crime here isn't what Mr. Cade did to defend me. It's what my family did when they decided I wasn't worth defending." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The testimony continued for another hour, but Mercy could feel the momentum shifting in their favor. Ruth Peterson took the stand to describe the medical evidence that supported their story. Sheriff Morrison testified about the powder burns on Boyd's hands and the inconsistencies in the Callahan family's account. Even old Walt Jenkins, the town drunk, testified that he'd heard Boyd bragging about solving the family problem the night before they'd ridden out to Widow's Point. When Judge Hartwell finally called for a recess to consider his verdict, Mercy knew they'd won. She could hear it in the way people were talking, could feel it in the subtle shift of sympathy that had occurred during the proceedings. "Miss Callahan, Mr. Cade," the judge said when court reconvened an hour later. "Please rise." They stood together, Mercy's hand finding Ezra's arm for support and comfort. The room fell silent as Judge Hartwell prepared to render his decision. "I find the charges against both defendants to be without merit," he announced. "The evidence clearly shows that Mr. Cade acted in defense of Miss Callahan's life, and that Miss Callahan was the victim of abandonment and attempted murder by her own family members." Relief flooded through Mercy so intensely that her knees nearly buckled. They were free, they were vindicated. The nightmare was finally over. "However," Judge Hartwell continued, and Mercy's heart clenched at the word, "I am issuing a warrant for the arrest of Boyd and Jeremiah Callahan on charges of attempted murder and conspiracy. Sheriff Morrison, please execute this warrant immediately." The sound of handcuffs clicking shut on her uncle and cousin should have brought Mercy satisfaction, but instead she felt only a deep sadness for what her family had become. They'd chosen cruelty over kindness, selfishness over sacrifice, and now they would face the consequences of those choices. As the courtroom began to empty, Mercy found herself standing alone with Ezra in the space where her fate had been decided. The morning sun, streaming through the windows, felt like a benediction, warming her face and reminding her that she was alive, free, and no longer alone. "What happens now?" she asked, the question that had haunted her for days finally spoken aloud. "Now," Ezra said, his voice carrying a warmth she'd never heard before, "we figure out what comes next, together if you're willing." "Together," Mercy agreed. And for the first time since her accident, the word didn't sound like a burden or a charity case. It sounded like a choice, freely made by two people who'd found something worth fighting for in each other. Outside, the town of Broken Mesa was returning to its normal rhythms, but for Mercy Callahan and Ezra Cade, normal was about to take on an entirely new meaning. They'd survived abandonment, violence, and injustice. They'd faced their demons and emerged stronger, and as they walked out of that makeshift courtroom into the bright promise of a new day, they carried with them the most precious gift of all, the knowledge that true sight had nothing to do with eyes, and everything to do with the courage to see each other clearly, completely, and with love. The blind cowgirl had found her vision at last, and it was more beautiful than anything she'd ever seen with her eyes. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us. Dawn brought the sound of hammering as the townspeople of Broken Mesa erected a makeshift courtroom in the hotel's dining room. Mercy sat on a wooden chair near the window, feeling the morning sun warm her face while listening to the bustle of preparation around her. The contrast between last night's violence and this morning's civilized proceedings felt surreal, like waking from a nightmare into a world that followed different rules entirely. "Nervous?" Ezra's voice came from beside her, rough with exhaustion, but tinged with something that might have been relief. She turned toward him, surprised by how much comfort his presence brought her. "I thought they were keeping you locked up until the hearing." Judge Hartwell decided that a man who'd been shot defending a woman probably wasn't a flight risk. She could hear the smile in his voice, but underneath it was something harder, more guarded. Besides, he wanted us to sit together during the proceedings, said it would make the truth easier to sort out. The truth, such a simple concept that had become impossibly complicated over the past few days. Mercy's fingers found the rough fabric of her skirt, tracing the tears and stains that marked her journey from abandoned victim to whatever she was now. "Ezra," she said quietly, aware that others might be listening, "whatever happens today, I want you to know—" "Save it," he interrupted gently. "We're both walking out of here when this is over. Count on it." The conviction in his voice should have been reassuring, but Mercy detected something underneath it, a tension that suggested he wasn't as confident as he sounded. She wanted to press him about what he wasn't telling her, but the sound of boots on wooden floors announced the arrival of the principals in their drama. Boyd entered first, his right hand wrapped in bandages that spoke of Doc Peterson's skill and Ezra's accuracy. Behind him came Uncle Jeremiah, moving with the careful steps of a man nursing multiple wounds and a damaged reputation. The third man Mercy didn't recognize by sound or smell, but his presence carried the weight of legal authority. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Hartwell," the bailiff announced, though the formality seemed almost absurd in the hotel dining room turned courtroom. The proceedings began with testimonies that felt like performances, each side presenting their version of events with carefully chosen words and strategic omissions. Boyd painted a picture of family concern twisted into tragedy by outside interference. Uncle Jeremiah spoke of difficult decisions made for the greater good. Their lawyer, a thin man with a nasal voice, spun a tale of misunderstanding and self-defense that bore little resemblance to Mercy's memories of abandonment and betrayal. But it was when Ezra took the witness chair that the real drama began. "State your full name for the record," Judge Hartwell requested. "Ezra Matthew Cade," he replied, his voice steady despite the weight of scrutiny from the packed room. "And your occupation, Mr. Cade?" A pause, so brief that most people probably missed it, but Mercy caught the slight hesitation. "Currently unemployed, Your Honor. Former cavalry scout." "Former," the prosecutor repeated, pouncing on the word like a cat on a mouse. "Tell us about the circumstances of your departure from military service." Mercy felt her stomach clench as Ezra's breathing changed, becoming more controlled, more deliberate. Whatever was coming, he'd been dreading this moment. "He was court-martialed for striking a superior officer," Ezra said, his words falling into the quiet room like stones into still water. "Striking," the prosecutor continued. "That's a rather mild way to describe what happened, isn't it? According to the military records I've obtained, you nearly killed Lieutenant Colonel Harrison with your bare hands." The room erupted in whispers and gasps. Mercy felt the atmosphere shift around them, felt the weight of public opinion tilting against the man who'd saved her life. But she also heard something else in the prosecutor's voice, the satisfaction of a hunter who'd finally cornered his. "Ye pray. Tell the court what provoked this violent assault," Judge Hartwell said, his voice cutting through the noise. Ezra was quiet for so long that Mercy began to wonder if he'd decided not to answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of old pain and carefully controlled rage. "We'd captured a group of Apache women and children after a raid," he said. "Non-combatants, mostly elderly and young. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison ordered them to be Interrogated for information about warrior movements. Interrogated how? The judge pressed. By methods that violated every rule of warfare and human decency, Ezra replied, his voice growing harder. Methods that turned soldiers into something worse than the enemies we were fighting. Mercy could hear the tension in the room ratcheting up, could feel the crowd hanging on every word. This wasn't just about her anymore. This was about the kind of man Ezra really was, and whether his past made him a hero or a criminal. And you took it upon yourself to stop these interrogations? I tried to intervene through proper channels. First, Ezra said, when that failed, when I watched children being tortured for information they didn't have, I made a choice. You made a choice to assault your commanding officer. I made a choice to be human instead of a soldier. The words hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel. Mercy could feel the courtroom holding its breath, waiting to see how this revelation would affect the proceedings. Mr. Cade, Judge Hartwell said quietly, do you regret that choice? Every day, Your Honor. Not because I struck Harrison, but because I waited so long to do it. The silence that followed was broken by Boyd's harsh laughter. So we're supposed to trust the judgment of a man who attacks his own officers, who thinks violence is the answer to everything. Ezra's chair creaked as he turned to face Boyd directly. I think violence is sometimes the only answer to greater violence. I think there are lines that can't be crossed without consequences. And I think men who abandon blind women in the desert are exactly the kind of men who need to be reminded of those lines.